إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن سيدنا ونبينا محمدا عبده ورسوله أرسله الله تعالى بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله وكفى بالله شهيدا فصلوات الله وسلامه عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن استنى بسنته واهتدى بهديه إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So, brothers and sisters, now, more than any other time in recent history, Americans are concerned about race, about racism, race relations, racial equality, and or the lack thereof. And in our own communities, Muslim Americans have also begun to discuss race more frequently, more openly, more candidly than they had in the past. And at the time of this race-centered awakening, I present this lecture in which I state the obvious, that America has a race problem. America has always had a race problem. I also admit that Muslims and Muslim communities, by and large, have a race problem. But I contend with complete conviction that the problem Muslims have with race and racism is not because of Islam, but rather despite Islam. Because Islam has provided the solution to racism as it has provided solutions to so many other social ills. Now, when I give a lecture like this, typically, especially if the lecture has some juristic relationship with juristic rulings, halal and haram, etc., typically what I do is I lay down some Islamic principles to guide our discussion. Universally accepted truths, incontestable facts, what we call givens, musallamat in Islam. And I do something what we call in Islam, especially when it relates to matters of fiqh, we do something called tahrir mahall al-niza'. And this is where you clarify what the people who have differed about the specific issue, you clarify the areas where they all agree. And this way you narrow your focus to the issue where they differ, and you avoid confusing the matter and mixing the issues where they already agree with those issues where they differ. But after giving it more thought, and I had intended to do that in this lecture, but after giving it more thought, it seems that for this discussion this is not necessary, and for the sake of time it should be omitted. So I will not do that for this particular discussion. But I do have some points that I do intend to discuss, and what I'd like to do is share those points at the outset and then take each point one by one so everybody can get an idea of what we intend to discuss. So first and foremost, I wanted to respond to some common misconceptions within our community regarding the discussion of race. The second thing I wanted to do was talk about what is race and what constitutes racism from the Islamic perspective. Number three, I wanted to give a chronology of racism and racial inequality in America. This is something which is necessary. I do not intend to spend a great deal of time on it, but it is very necessary because a lot of people in our community fail, whether they be African American or non-African Americans, they really fail to understand the depth and breadth of racism and the far-reaching effects of racism in America. And because of that, they have a hard time discussing this issue and giving its due in those discussions and dialogues. The fourth matter is I wanted to mention the various responses to racism in America, Euro-Christian / Western Christianity responses to racism, and then mention Islam's approach and response, which is the heart of the matter. And last but not least, close the discussion with some important closing remarks and some advices for us as Muslims and as a Muslim community. With that said, I'd like to speak briefly about some of the common misconceptions. I'd like to briefly respond to some of those common misconceptions and erroneous assumptions and assertions regarding racism and race relations in the Muslim community. Specifically here, brothers and sisters, in America. It is not uncommon for Muslims to think or say that a lecture like this one is, and a discussion centered around race, or any discussion centered around race, is not necessary. And they support that assertion that we don't even need to be talking about this. This is a waste of time. And they support that assertion with a number of different arguments. So I'd like to mention some of those arguments and respond to them in brief. One of the first common arguments is that racism is not a problem in the Muslim community. Why are we talking about something which is not really an issue for us? There is no racism in Islam. And although that statement is true, the assertion that is made that that statement is being used to support is not true. To say that there's no racism amongst the Muslims, there's no racism in our community, that's not true. Although there being no racism in Islam is true. We have to differentiate between Islam and the Muslims. Islam is perfect, the Muslims are imperfect. There's no racism in Islam, but there is racism in the Muslim community. And this tafriq is something that the Prophet ﷺ himself, he made on a number of occasions, and also something which is what? It's common sense. So if you look at the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, which he said, أَرْبَعٌ فِي أُمَّتِي مِنْ أَمْرِ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ لَا يَتْرُكُونَهُنَّ. He said there are 4 things from Jahiliyyah that my ummah will not abandon. Even though the Prophet said in the other hadith that Jahiliyyah is under his foot, he came to eradicate Jahiliyyah, that some of the Jahiliyyah would remain, and some of the members of his ummah, some of the people's ummah would practice those things even though Islam is wholly against them. And I'll mention 2 of them. He said al-fakhru fil ahsab. He said a person being proud and boastful regarding his status. وَالطَّعْنُ فِي الْأَنْسَابِ, and a person attacking and putting down another person's lineage. And those 2 things are types, from the Islamic perspective, are types of racism, as we're going to see. So the Prophet ﷺ is saying that this is something that will exist amongst the Muslims, even though Islam is wholly against it. Also consider, brothers and sisters, from the common sense perspective, if you were to ask yourself, if you were to ask any Muslim, what is the number 1 thing that Islam is against? The number 1 sin that Islam opposes, the greatest sin in the sight of Allah, everybody would say, everybody should say, shirk, polytheism, idolatry, associationism, right? And this is something, if you look in the Quran, you will not see anything which the Quran has more strongly spoken about and spoken against and promoted its opposite, a tawheed, than what? Than a shirk. That being the case, there are still Muslims who do what? Commit a shirk. So there can be, Islam can be totally against something like racism, but there can still be racism amongst what? Amongst the Muslims. And so the 2 are not contradictory, and that statement is not what? Is not factual. But number 2 from the erroneous assertions and misconceptions is that some people, they rail against the statement that some people make, particularly in this case African Americans make. They'll say something, for example, my people, that I care about my people, or I want to help my people, I want to guide my people. Just the use of that word, people will say that statement itself is nationalist or tribalist, that statement itself is wrong, because it is a statement which is synonymous or indicative of nationalism and tribalism. And this is wrong. That assertion is wrong. Because the prophets of Allah were the furthest and far removed from any type of impeachable quality. Anything that Islam disapproves of, they were the furthest and farthest removed from that. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala throughout the Quran, when He mentions to us the stories of the prophets, we find Him telling us about them addressing their people with the word Ya Qawmi. For example, it's repeated in Surah Al-A'raf, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the different prophets who came to their people. He mentions that they said, فَقَالَ يَا قَوْمِ اعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ مَا لَكُم مِّنْ إِلَٰهٍ غَيْرُهُ. That they all said, O my people, worship Allah, you have no deity besides Him. There's no God besides Him. They all said, Ya Qawm. Allah is telling us that they said it, and also tacitly approving of them saying it. And the greatest example and the gold standard of conduct is our beloved Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, who was on the plain of Uhud in the battle in which a number of his companions were killed. His beloved uncle Hamza was killed and his body was mutilated, and the Prophet himself was badly beaten. His tooth was broken, his face was bloodied, and after the battle ended and he barely escaped with his life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he stood on the plain of Uhud, catching the blood and wiping the blood from his face so that it wouldn't hit the ground, because he knew that the punishment of Allah would inflict the people who had done this to him if one drop of blood of his hit the ground. And he stood there praying for the people who had done this to him, and he used the word qawmi. He said, Allahumma gfir li qawmi fa innahum la ya'lamun. Oh Allah, forgive my people, for they don't know any better. They don't know anybody. He called them his people, and he was fighting him, and some of them had tried to kill him. So the use of this word, saying that word, or the use of that word, of that expression, is synonymous or indicative of tribalism and nationalism, that's unfounded. And the sunnah of our beloved Prophet and of the prophets in general refutes that. Another common or statement that I've seen being said is that we have ignoramuses calling kuffar our brothers. And with respect to this statement, I won't deal with the issue of whether or not it's permissible to call someone who is from your qawm, from your people, your brother or not. We could definitely argue that that is not appropriate at the very least. But what I want to focus on is the use of the word ignoramuses, and how this contradicts adab al-khilaf, the etiquette of differing. And it's just, it strikes me how we talk out of one side of our mouth about al-wala wal-bara, that the wilaya, the loyalty, the fellow feeling, the connection should be, the alliance, the allegiance should be for the Muslims and for the believers. That's what we say out of one side of our mouth. And then on the other side of our mouth, when someone differs from us, who is from that community, from our community, we'll call them by these very despicable names, in spite of the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, bi'sal ismul fusuqu ba'dal iman. How evil it is that you call a person who has believed by an offensive nickname after they have believed. This is what Allah says about these people. And the Prophet said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Man adali waliyan adantuhu bil harb. He said, whoever expresses or shows enmity towards one of my awliya, one of my close friends. And who are the awliya? The believers. Adantuhu bil harb. I declare war against him. So it just amazes me how out of one side of our mouth we're saying that we should have loyalty and allegiance to each other, and then we show something which contradicts that, or we do something or say something which contradicts that. But another shubha, another misconception is where a person says, for example, you can be loyal to your ethnicity all you want. My loyalty isn't with any group besides the Muslims as a whole. And this is one of those statements which, at the surface of it, it appears truthful, but there's some falsehood to it. And basically, because what it does is it gives one impression and makes a false assumption, and then rules on that assumption. So, for example, there's no question that al-wala, the loyalty, the allegiance, the friendship, is supposed to be for Allah, for the messenger, and for the believers. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, إِنَّمَا وَلِيُّكُمُ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. Your loyalty, your allegiance, your friendship is only for Allah and His Messenger and those who believe. There's no question. But the problem is that we're equating loyalty with a person establishing justice and railing against and being opposed to the oppression of any people, which is part of our deen. That if a person stands up and says the oppression of African Americans in the United States is wrong, if a person says that, that is not a statement of wala, nor is it a contradiction of any of our religious principles. In fact, our principles, our religious principles, demand that we stand for justice even if it's in favor of someone we don't like, even if it's in favor of someone who's a non-Muslim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu kunu qawwamina lillahi shuhada bil qist ولا يجرمنكم شنآن قوم على ألا تعدلوا اعدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O you who believe, stand out firmly as witnesses for Allah. Stand out firmly as witnesses for Allah and people who support justice. And let not your hatred for a people cause you to deviate from justice. Be just. That is closer to piety. And if you notice the way that the ayah is worded, it's general. It means be just to everyone, regardless if they are friend or foe. And be against oppression, whether that oppression be against friend or foe. Where you ekkid that, this is further confirmed and emphasized by the Qudsi hadith, in which the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ibadi, inni harramtu dhulma ala nafsi. وَجَعَلْتُهُ بَيْنَكُمْ مُحَرَّمًا فَلَا تَظَالَمُوا. He said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O my servants, I have indeed prohibited myself from committing oppression and have made oppression illegal amongst you. So do not oppress one another. Ya ibadi, my servants. That includes what? The mu'min, the believer, and the non-believer. طيب, another erroneous misconception is the statement that has been made by one of them. The sheer hypocrisy that I see from some of the African American brothers is disgusting, to say the least. And so basically there's a few things here. One is the use of the word hypocrisy, which again contradicts something we mentioned earlier, adab al-khilaf. That when we differ with somebody, we don't call them names. You differ with me, it's a matter in which differences of opinion are permitted. And so let's talk, let's have a dialogue, and let's put the name calling to the side. People are quick to put these names, to start calling names when they disagree with someone and the person doesn't accept, or basically when they give their argument, the person gives a counter argument. And so immediately what follows that is name calling and accusations, and a person basically assailing the person's what? The person's intention, their character, the sincerity of their faith, calling them names like hypocrite, disbeliever, etc. This is contradictory to adab al-khilaf, and this is a problem that the Muslims have to learn how to differ, how to have an opposing view and not become so emotional that we start to just fling insults. And the fact that a person does that is a sign that they don't have a sound argument. Because if you have a sound argument, you don't need to insult your opponent. You just what? You just reason and rationalize and present your argument in a convincing manner. Second issue with this is that a person saying, for example, Black Lives Matter or racism is wrong, none of that opposes the teachings of our religion. In fact, it's consistent with the teachings of our religion. So how can the person who says or does that or promotes those ideas be considered a munafiq, a hypocrite? And also, last but not least, to respond to this is that you can see this double standard. Is that, wallahi, brothers and sisters, when people from Palestine talk about Palestine and what the Jews, the Zionist Jews and the Zionist state of Israel is doing in occupied Palestine, doing to them, doing to their people, none of us begrudges them the right to speak about this and to be opposed to this and say that what they're doing to my people in Palestine is wrong. Many of us ourselves will say that what's being done to the Palestinians, even though we're not Palestinians, is wrong. We will say that. And when those Palestinians say that, no one tells them that they are hypocrites for doing so, that they have they've been guilty or become guilty of nationalism or tribalism. None of us does that. So why is it when African Americans say the same thing about people who share their skin color and their culture and share their experience, that they are being oppressed, they're being wronged? Why is it that they are now nationalists? Why is it that the Muslims among them who say this are now hypocrites? It's a double standard, brothers and sisters. Another erroneous misconception, assertion, or related to that, I don't know if this is necessarily an assumption, but basically it's, I guess, a wrong approach, is that what we've seen recently, and I think it's well intended, is that, for example, you see these lectures popping up where people are having like dialogues and discussions and open meetings, virtual meetings, where they talk about, the issues of race. People trying to have these discussions, and it's good. The intention is good. But for example, you hear them, for example, they'll title and center the discussion around, for example, an issue like how to make our mosques more welcoming to our African American brothers and sisters, for example. And just the wording of the title is indicative of having, the wrong idea of what's going on and how best to respond to it. Because when you start saying how to make our African American brothers feel more welcome in our mosques, right there's a problem. If we are brothers and sisters, why is it our mosque? Why do we have this othering? Why do we have this concept of theirs and ours and yours, mine and yours? That should, if we're all brothers, it should be what? All of our mosques. All of our mosques, not our mosques. Because what? We dominated it. Most the people from our particular country or region, or who have our, for example, our ethnicity or our language, we are the majority. We're the ones who founded it. We're the ones who built it. So it's our mosque. That type of language is wrong. Also, if you say, for example, how can we make our African American brothers feel more welcome in our spaces, in our masajid, it implies that you want to find out, discuss how we can put on a show, how we can make sure that we don't misbehave when company comes. We don't really want to change who we are, but we want to what? Give an impression that will be what? More acceptable, more palatable to them. But we don't really want to change. It means that we don't really want to solve the problem and affect real change. We just want to change what? The appearance. And our religion is a religion which doesn't want us to change the appearance, doesn't want us to make cosmetic changes. It wants us to make what? Real change. Real change from the inside out, not from the outside and forget about the inside. And our religion is very much against, since the word hypocrisy was thrown around, has been thrown around by some people, it's very against hypocrisy. That we show a face, but inside and our real feelings contradict what we're showing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He rails against this in the Quran, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam rails against it in the Sunnah. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the munafiqeen, this as being their quality. He says, for example, إِنَّ الْمُنَافِقِينَ يُخَادِعُونَ اللَّهَ وَهُوَ خَادِعُهُمْ وَإِذَا قَامُوا إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ قَامُوا كُسَالَى يُرَاءُونَ النَّاسَ وَلَا يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. He says, indeed, the hypocrites, they seek to beguile Allah. But Allah is the one who beguiles them. And if they stand to pray, they stand only to show, to give an ostentatious display of piety. وَلَا يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. And they don't mention Allah except very little. There's nothing, it's hollow. It's a hollow gesture. There's nothing on the inside. It's just all on what? It's all cosmetics. All smoke and mirrors. Allah is saying this to them, saying this to criticize them, to say that their action is wrong. Muslims are not supposed to do that in any issue that they do. The Muslims are supposed to be the people who their inside reflects their outside, and their outside reflects their inside. But from the shubuhat, from the assertions, and this is the final one I want to mention, is we have a problem in our communities where we do something which is, it's very problematic for the one who is on the receiving end of oppression, on the receiving end of racism, on the receiving end of prejudice. We do this commonly. And that is that when the people in power, they prefer a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace and the presence of justice and fairness. These people are more devoted to what? To order than they are to justice. They would rather pretend that everything is okay. And they encourage this. Just come on, let's just pretend that everything is okay. Let's just get along. Let's just get along and keep the peace. Okay, the apparent peace. Even if people are saying and doing things that make a particular group feel disenfranchised, looked over, left out, etc. They'll say things like, for example, be patient. That's just the way some of our elders are. Things will change in time. They say things like this to pacify the people who are being oppressed and to tell them to basically, in other words, accept the oppression so we can all just what? Get along and there won't be what? Fitna, as they say. So these are some of the common things that are said surrounding the issue of race, and they're wrong. Our religion is opposed to people who are being treated unjustly, that they're supposed to accept the injustice. And you find the Prophet ﷺ standing up for the looked over, for the left out, for the lowest, for the least. You stand up repeatedly, standing up for those people. And our deen stands for that. As we find the hadith of Abi Sa'id al-Khudri collected by Muslim, "Man ra'a minkum munkaran falyughayyirhu biyadihi." Whoever amongst you sees some wrong, then let him change it with his hand. Irrespective of who is involved, change it if you have the power and authority to do so. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَبِلِسَانِهِ. And whoever amongst you is not able to do that, then let him do it with what? With his tongue. Speak out against it. Say, we're against this, we're opposed to this. And only in the case when you're unable to do the first two can you do what? Just hate it in your heart. In many cases, people are able to do things. They're able to do something about it, and they don't do it. And what that does, it creates and it embitters. It embitters. And I know brothers who they went overseas, they studied, and they experienced racism. And I'm not talking about racism just from the common people, although they did experience racism in the society in which they lived. They experienced it from their teachers. They experienced it in the institutions of learning where they studied, and they're bitter. I can hear it in their voices. I myself, I probably have some of that bitterness with me. I experienced some stuff and, probably traumatized by it to some degree. And since I've been back here, I've experienced things. I've been in situations where I've applied for positions. I was the most qualified applicant by far, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn. And I didn't get it. I didn't even get a call back. And then I was ultimately told by a sincere individual who was an active member in the hiring process, saying that, Akhi, I'm sorry, but it was just jahiliyyah. You have to forgive our elders. You have to pardon them, man. They're just ignorant, man. And they just couldn't see a person like you being the face of our community. I've been told that on my face. And so we have to understand that this type of behavior and being, not just doing it ourselves, having this problem in our community, we're going to talk about that more shortly, but not just having it, but belittling it and sweeping it under the rug and telling a person who's been a victim of racism, and that has affected him, whether it affected his livelihood, whether it traumatized him, affected him emotionally, psychologically, telling that person to just what? To be patient and understand that's just how our elders are and this type of thing. So these are some of the erroneous assertions and assumptions that we hear around this issue, and I wanted to address those one by one. And now we'll go to the second point, which was what is race and what constitutes racism in Islam. Now there is a common view that is trending, brothers and sisters, that says that the concept of race as we currently know it and the racism that stems from it is a product of two things: colonial capitalism and the European Enlightenment. So this is a common trending theory And basically what it says is that it was only around the 17th and 18th centuries that the pseudoscience of race emerged, which viewed biology, genetics, and physical appearance as the basis for defining race and also determining a person's worth, inherent behavior, and intelligence, their abilities, and their proper place in society. This science that makes these assertions, they say it only emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries. And they say basically before that, people didn't view physical features as a basis for race, but rather they focused more on what? On ancestry and lineage, right? That was the basis for what? Determining what race a person belonged to. But the problem with this theory, and many others, is that it views race through an ethnocentric lens. Basically views race and says, okay, how do we know what race is and what it was and when did it become this and when did it become that? We look and see what did Western Europe, how did they view? What did Western European society, how did they view race? At one point in history versus another point in history, before the Enlightenment, after the Enlightenment, and then we use that and say, this is what race, was, and this is what it has become. But it doesn't consider, this view, it doesn't consider the view and practices of other civilizations that predate Western Europe. Western Europe is not the first civilization, not the earliest civilization. There were civilizations before that. How did they view it? We just ignore that. We make the Western European society the gold standard in determining what was race and what is race. And with their shifts, we say that, okay, race was this, and then it shifted to this, and we don't consider what other civilizations, which predate Western European society, what did they have to say about it? Well, in Islam, which is what really should matter to us as Muslims, we are taught that Iblis deemed himself superior to Adam, despised him, and set out to destroy him and his unborn progeny, purely on the basis of what we call al-unsuriyya. Origins, genetics, biology, and what he was made of versus what Iblis was made of. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, repeats the story repeatedly. He says, for example, in Surah Al-A'raf, he says, ثُمَّ قُلْنَا لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ اسْجُدُوا لِآدَمَ فَسَجَدُوا إِلَّا إِبْلِيسَ لَمْ يَكُنْ مِنَ السَّاجِدِينَ قَالَ مَا مَنَعَكَ أَلَّا تَسْجُدْ إِذْ أَمَرْتُكَ قَالَ أَنَا خَيْرٌ مِنْهُ خَلَقْتَنِي مِنْ نَارٍ وَخَلَقْتَهُ مِنْ طِينٍ. Allah says, we told the angels, prostrate yourselves to Adam. And so they did. Except Iblis, he refused to be from those who prostrate. Allah said, what prevented you, O Iblis, from prostrating when I command you to do so? Iblis said, I am better than him. You created me from fire, and him you created from clay. So in essence, brothers and sisters, Iblis was the first racist, the first bigot. And his racism was based upon what? It was based upon ancestry? No, it was based upon genetics and physical makeup, al-unsur. After Iblis, racism didn't disappear and only reappear in 17th or 18th century European society or in the colonies of the European nations. Rather, after Iblis, racism what? It evolved and it morphed, assuming different forms depending upon the time, place, and circumstances. Sometimes it appeared in the form of group affiliation-based prejudice, tribalism, and nationalism. Like what existed before the coming of the Prophet ﷺ in Arabia, and after what? After his passing. So post-Islam Arabia pre-Islam Arabia and post-Islam Arabia had versions of what? Of this type of racism. And we know, for example, that the Arabs of the Prophet's time had this tribal hierarchy. That certain tribes were considered what? The ashraf, the noble tribes, the nobility. And other tribes were considered what? Mutawassita. They were considered what? Kind of like in the middle in terms of their nobility. And some tribes were considered mutadanniya, ignoble. They were considered what? The lower tribes. And you had another level, which was the Mawali, those people who had no tribal connections, but they became affiliated, they became affiliates of certain tribes. Then you have the foreigners, right? People who came from outside of Arabia, they learned Arabic, but they weren't Arabs. So you had this existing during the time of the Prophet and even after the Prophet's passing. Sometimes racism appeared in class-based prejudice. Sometimes in the form of colorism. And that existed before, during, and after the Prophet's time. Colorism. So racism based upon what? Color. The color of your skin. And sometimes in the form of religious and cult-based caste systems, like what existed and continues to exist in India, has existed, according to some estimates, for 2,000 years in 2,000 years in India. The caste system has existed. But at the end of the day, racism has always existed from the time of Iblis in one form or another, and is not something new or relatively new. So therefore, from the Islamic perspective, what is racism? Racism, from the Islamic perspective, is broad, and it's when you view or treat people differently based upon something material or tangible, which Islam has not used as a basis to what? To be the determining factor on how people are treated. That's how Islam views racism. Anytime you take something and you make it the basis for how you're going to treat someone, what status you're going to give to someone, what you will afford a person of opportunities, and what you will deny them, that's what Islam calls racism, regardless whether it's based upon caste, socioeconomic status, color, lineage, etc., and so on. So the view of Islam on racism is what? It's broader than just what? Than just colorism or ethnic prejudice, etc. Like the next point we wanted to deal with was racism and racial inequality in America, a brief chronology. Brief chronology. Don't want to spend too much time, but I feel like it's necessary to mention this before we get to the next point. Why? Because too often, especially in our community, it's belittled. It's just downplayed. You talk with people, it comes up, and people will basically say, get over it, man. Get over it. It's not that serious. This is something that happened 400 years ago. Come on, man, get over it. They'll say things like this, or they'll say things which carry this meaning. And they don't really understand how serious racism is, how serious it was, how serious it is, and they don't understand the residual effects of racism and how racism become institutionalized. Something that is imposed by institutions, and therefore it is inescapable for the people who it's directed at, the objects of it. And so for this reason, I feel like it's necessary to talk about this briefly. I don't want to spend too much time on it. And what I definitely don't want to do is I don't want to make this, especially for any listeners who are not African Americans and who don't really understand without having been told these things. I don't want to make it seem like a pity party, which is what a lot of immigrant Muslims, when we bring these subjects up, that's how they perceive it. Like, look, you're just feeling sorry for yourself. You need to get over it. Pick yourself up by your bootstraps and, and make something out of yourself. That's the attitude that they give you. But again, this is not, when African Americans talk about this in general, they're not talking about this seeking pity. But they want to clarify that the matter is not as easy as some people may assume. That it's particularly hard for African Americans. Why? Because of how racism, the residual effects of racism, whether those be psychological, emotional, etc., relate to the family, familial, domestic, but also the institutionalized nature of racism in this country. So let's go through it quickly, inshallah ta'ala. The first one, obviously, is slavery, which began in approximately 1619 and lasted for about 250 years. 250 years of race-based chattel slavery, right? Then you have post-Civil War terrorism. So in the Reconstruction period, when black people started to empower themselves, they started to take elected office, they started to become entrepreneurs, they started to own land and own businesses, etc. And some white people were threatened. They felt threatened by this. Then you had the emergence of certain groups, domestic terrorist organizations, which were set up to intimidate blacks and to put them, quote unquote, in their place, put them back in their place. You also had organized massacres that occurred, and there were a handful of those that occurred around the country again, to intimidate blacks, etc. Then you had what they call the convict leasing system, or peonage. You can call it debt slavery, you can call it debt servitude, which has also been called slavery by another name. And basically what this was that laws were enacted after slavery and after the Reconstruction period. Laws were enacted specifically to arrest blacks in mass and force them into peonage. Tens of thousands of African Americans were arbitrarily arrested, charged with crimes like vagrancy, but they were often guilty of nothing. And they were hit with outrageous fines and charged court costs and charged for their own arrests. And obviously, when these fines, which were huge for very minor offenses, these ostensible fines were so, enormous that they couldn't afford to pay them. The only option under the law was for them to work off their debt and to be loaned out as free labor to coal mines, lumber camps, brickyards, railroads, quarries, and farm plantations, etc. And this went on for years after the end of slavery. So slavery just continued by another name. But another aspect was Jim Crow, which was basically the segregation of schools, neighborhoods, parks, restrooms, and other public spaces. Also, the denial of basic human rights and civil rights. Brothers and sisters, you have to know that the right to life was denied African Americans in many parts of this country. Lynching was legal. There was no law against legal in many states. It was legal to take a black man's life with no cause. That was completely legal. Denied basic human and civil rights, let alone civil rights. Couldn't vote, couldn't do a lot of things, right? Another issue is racial covenants and redlining and the creation of the black ghetto. And there's a few sub-points I'd like to mention, Abd'Llah, under this one. So obviously these racial covenants and redlining, racial covenants basically means that for example, a contractor who's going to build a housing complex or a housing, a subdivision or something, a neighborhood, would have to get money from the government, a loan from the government to build this subdivision and then ultimately sell those homes, would have to agree to only sell them to white people and to put a covenant, put language in the deed that said that it could not be purchased by an African American, it could not be sold after purchase to an African American, it could not even be rented or leased to an African American family. So that's what they call racial covenants. You also had redlining, where banks and governments, banks, local, city, state, and federal governments got together and basically carved out parts of the city and said, this is where, these are places where blacks will live, blacks can live. These are places where whites live. And these are the places where we will give money, the governments that is, will give money to investors. And these are the places where if a white family wants to buy a home, we will lend them money to buy homes. So they created neighborhoods which were specifically white and neighborhoods which were specifically, exclusively black, the ghetto. And the effect of that, there's a few effects of it. I will mention those out of Ojala. One, it obviously affected housing, first and foremost, the quality of housing, the location of housing, the lending that a person could get, and obviously if the lending was impacted, ownership. So it made it very difficult for blacks to have upward mobility and to live in places that they wanted to live. If they wanted to leave the ghetto, it made it difficult for them to do that because they couldn't get loans to buy homes. And they wouldn't get loans to buy homes in the ghetto because those places were considered to be a risk, a financial risk, etc. Another way it affected these racial covenants and redlining affected generational and individual family wealth. And that's why you have this huge wealth gap in America to this day, to the point that it's estimated that for every $100 that a white family has, a black family has $5.04. For every $100 a white family has, an African American family has $5.04. It also affected education. There's a few sub-points under that. Education affected what? School funding. Because school funding is based upon property taxes, right? So the schools in the black neighborhood where properties are historically devalued, or priced at a lower, they're given a lower, assigned a lower value, then the amount of property taxes that come and can go to school funding was what? Was lower. That also affected classroom sizes. Fewer schools meant more students had to go to one school, and more students would be packed into what? Classrooms. Also affected teacher salaries. Also affected access to tutoring and extracurricular activities, giving African Americans fewer opportunities to get a quality education and to gain skills, whether tangible or intangible, that would help them to what? To be successful beyond school. Also, under racial covenants and redlining, you have higher unemployment because they have poor levels of education, less education, fewer opportunities means fewer jobs. And although they have fewer opportunities to get employment, they have the same basic needs as their white counterparts, which leads us to what? Another thing that racial covenants and redlining affected was incarceration. That when you have the same basic needs and you have fewer opportunities, you try your darndest to make a buck doing something legal, some people, invariably are going to resort to what? Doing illegal things. And they're going to be what? Incarcerated. Another point under the general category of racism, racial inequality, is intentional miseducation and racist indoctrination. There's a few points here I'd like to mention on the Ujala. So basically, here in the Americas, they adopted the concept of indoctrination, miseducation, presenting a narrative and forcing that narrative down the throats of whites and blacks that basically created the idea in the mind of blacks and whites that whites were superior. So one of them, obviously, that jumps right out at you is Jesus being portrayed as white, blonde-haired, and blue-eyed. Although that's not consistent with what? That's ahistorical. But that's how he was portrayed. And that indoctrinates you. If your God looks like you, then you think, okay, I'm better. I'm better. I look like God and God looks like me. That's what they say, obviously. But another thing, ancient Egyptians, they're portrayed, if you look at some history books, if you look in the movies, etc., they're portrayed as the archetype of whiteness. The archetype of whiteness. Typical white dude in what? In that headdress and everything. His skin is white, although we're talking about Egypt, right? But his skin is white as snow. There's no redness. There's no brown hue. The nose isn't, consistent with their noses. The features are not consistent, etc. Archetype of whiteness. That's how Egyptians are portrayed, to the point in some history books right now. Some of you guys might have children who, if you open up their history books and look at world history and the pictures that just depict Egypt, you might find a picture like that. Another example is world maps were scaled to make Anglo-Christian countries and regions appear larger than non-Anglo-Christian countries and regions. And the subliminal messaging there is obvious. Larger, bigger is better. It's more important. It's superior. Another one under this one is promoting race-based scientific theories as facts that prove the superiority of white Anglo-Saxons and the inferiority and rightful subordination of darker peoples. And last but not least under this one, whitewashing history and writing certain groups out of history to give the impression that they have no history or made minimal contributions to history and civilization. You get this impression that your people did nothing. I remember growing up, and my last year in high school, one of our very good teachers took us on a field trip to a library where they're going to give a presentation on African and African contributions to civilization, technology, history, etc. And this guy had a slideshow, and he, back in the day we used to use those like projectors. He had, a projection display, whatever you want to call it. Obviously, we didn't have slides back then. I'm kind of dating myself, but you get the point. And when he gave this really good presentation with pictures and imagery, and he just showed, man. He showed these contributions, and I was with a number of fellow students from a pretty much predominantly 99% African-American high school. And all of us, after seeing this lecture and being enlightened, we were so angry because we were about to graduate from high school. We'd spent, 12 years in school and we knew nothing about these things. We never learned about these things in school. That basically we were erased, and the achievements of our people and people who look like us were erased. And that has an effect on you. You really feel like, yeah, we're supposed to be where we are because we've never done anything. We've never been anything. And my wife is a teacher, and she recently told me that during Black History Month in her school, they did nothing. And there were some African American children in her school, and she was, quite concerned about them just throughout the year, how none of their culture and their achievements of their people were being highlighted at all. And when she asked about this, the teacher said, well, we're going to do something on Martin Luther King. We're going to do something on Martin Luther King. But I want you to think about what effect does that have on a child? If they go through school, they go through a whole school year, let alone 12 years of school, and they never see anything that their people ever did, except Martin Luther King, who marched and was beaten in order to get the basic human and civil rights that every person should have. It sends a message to the child that our people never did anything until the 50s and 60s, when one man emerged and did this one thing, led the civil rights movement, and that's it. What effect is that going to have on the child in terms of their self-esteem? And the belief that he, as an African American person, can achieve something, can achieve greatness. But versus when a white person is told that everything in history, every meaningful contribution that man has made to history and technology and science was made by a white person. It makes them feel what? It makes them feel superior, and that the natural order of things is for them to be on the top and everyone who doesn't look like them to be on the bottom. It's bad. It's bad. Another one under this racism, the chronology of racism in this country, is misrepresentation and dehumanization. We see that a lot. There's a lot of backlash about it now. Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben, the guy on the cream of wheat box. A lot of people are pushing back now. But for ages, the way African Americans have been portrayed in film, the way they've been portrayed just generally, is very poor, and that has an impact on our self-esteem and the self-esteem of our kids, etc. Another point that I'll close with is implicit bias and systemic racism. Some of these points we've mentioned, but we'll mention them again just to show that they are a part of the system creating an environment which makes it difficult on African Americans to succeed. One is education. We touched on that. Employment. We touched on that. Economics. We kind of touched on that. Predatory lending, loan, real estate discrimination, etc. Healthcare. This is a big problem where an African American person will go and see a doctor, and the treatment that they will receive for the exact same illness or the exact same symptoms will be different from a white person. And there have been studies that have shown, and one of the very prominent examples is that of Serena Williams, who when she was having, when she had her child, shortly thereafter she felt ill. There were some issues, there were some concerns, and the doctors were downplaying it. And she insisted they wouldn't give her, under normal circumstances, when a person exhibits these symptoms, they would give her a CT scan, they would give her these different types of scans. They didn't offer those scans. She insisted on having those scans, and sure enough, they found blood clots that, if they had not been discovered when they were discovered, could have led to her death. And this goes to show you, this is a woman who's rich. She's a very prominent personality. She's a celebrity. She's an athlete. And even her, the care that she received was inferior to what one of her white counterparts would have received. Another example is politics, representation, voter suppression. Big problem we're having still to this day. Policing. The way we're policed, African Americans are policed, and this is something that doesn't need discussion, doesn't need to be proved. There's just too much evidence out there. And it's sad that some people are still denying that police brutality, there's a huge disparity between how African Americans are policed versus other groups. Sentencing, when people are arrested and they're given a sentence, sentencing for African Americans is typically very much harsher. And last but not least, incarceration, the sentencing and the length of time and the number of people who are incarcerated. Although African Americans are in a minority and make up a small portion of the country, they make up a huge portion of the number of people who are incarcerated in our prisons. But the next issue at hand is how the U.S. has tried to address or deal with racial inequality. So we have these issues. How have Americans typically responded? One way is to enforce and encourage. They've actually enforced and encouraged racial discrimination, racial prejudice, racial inequality. Another common approach is ignore. Act like the problem just isn't there, because in many cases people, they like it this way. And therefore they're not inclined to change it. Even though they may not totally approve of it, they're not from the group that says enforce, encourage, they're benefiting from it. There's some privileges that they get from the things being this way. So why would we want to change it? We'll just ignore it, act like it's not there, right? I don't see racism, I don't see color. Everything's fine, we're all equal, right? We're all, as they'll say, we're all God's children, etc. Or they take the attitude, it will go away on its own, right? So we just have to wait it out. People over time will see how stupid racism is, and it'll just go away. Brothers and sisters, it has been 400 years. That attitude is going to go away. If it hasn't gone away in 400 years, it's not going to go away unless we make it go away. But another approach has been the approach of education, trying to educate. There are a number of people who have tried this approach. And one of the prominent personalities who tried it was Carter G. Woodson, who is the father of Black History Month, basically. And his idea was that the reason why African Americans are denied their human and civil rights in this country is because people just don't know how much they have contributed to civilization, and not just civilization in general, but to the American society. To American society, how much have they contributed to American society in terms of science, in terms of technology, in terms of inventions, etc. So he was setting out. It was his intent to set that right, to basically educate African Americans and whites, more importantly, about the accomplishments. He felt that if they see how much we've accomplished, how much we've contributed, they have to recognize also our worth and treat us as equals. But unfortunately, this approach, and it's also an approach which is adopted by people to this day. One of them, a prominent personality, is Jane Elliott, who is a European American, white Caucasian woman who actively tries to educate people in general and white people specifically about, racism and race-based prejudice, etc. But unfortunately, this approach has always been poorly applied and has received a lot of pushback and resistance from the first two groups, the group of encourage and enforce. They've pushed back aggressively, they've resisted aggressively, and also has received pushback from the group of its passive aggressive resistance from the second group, which is the group ignore. Just ignore it, it'll go away. Last but not least, America has tried legislation. America has always tried legislation and to put laws on the books that they feel will even the playing field and remove racial inequality. But this has always proved ineffective. Why? Because changing policy without changing the people changes nothing. Changing policy without changing the mindset of the people changes nothing. And we found this over and over again. Why do you have to make a law to say that a man is a man? Why do you have to make a law that says a man who was born here was here before a lot of the people who have the right to vote should have the right to vote? Why do you have to make a law like that? The problem is not the law. The problem is what? It's the mentality of the people. And because we change the law, but we don't change the mentality of the people, nothing changes. So now let's talk, brothers and sisters, about Islam's approach. What did Islam do differently? How has Islam approached this issue and provided, what solution has Islam provided for racism and racial inequality? Over 1400 years ago, brothers and sisters, Islam confronted racism, confronted tribalism and ethnic prejudice. Not only did Islam change the pervading policy, but it also moved to change the existing mentality. Not by asking or hoping that people would change the way they treated others, but rather demand that they do so. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, right, establishing a new policy. He says, Ya ayyuhan nasu, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha, wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'il lita'arafu, inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O mankind, we've created you from a single male and a single female, and made you nations and tribes to know one another. Indeed, the noblest of you with Allah is the most God-fearing and God-conscious. Verily, Allah is all-knowing, all-aware. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to change what? Change the mentality. Change the way people think and see race. And the scholars of tafsir have explained it. This meaning, what's the meaning of lita'arafu? To know one another. Al-Baghawi, for example, he said, so that you would know your near and distant relatives, not so that you would brag, boast, and hold others in contempt. And At-Tabari, he said, not because that renders you superior, or because your lineage makes you nearer or dearer to Allah, nay, the most exalted with Allah are the most pious and committed. So the mentality was something Islam was what? Keen to change, in addition to what? Changing the policy. When the Prophet ﷺ conquered Mecca, he addressed the people. Again, echoing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said. Echoing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said. He said, Ya ma'shar Quraysh, Inna Allah qad adhaba ankum nakhwat al-jahiliyyah, wa ta'adhumaha bil-aba. An-nasu min Adam, wa Adam min turab. He said, O people of Quraysh, surely Allah has abolished from you all the pride of the pre-Islamic era of ignorance, and all the pride in your ancestry. All men are descended from Adam, and Adam was made from dirt. Also, when the Prophet ﷺ came to know that one Muslim had insulted another because of the color of his mother's skin, not the color of his skin, the color of his mother's skin, he summoned that man, asked him, did you say this? Did you really say this? The Prophet checked him. He didn't let it slide. He didn't say, oh, that's just how our elders are. Oh, these people don't know any better. Oh, get over it. He didn't say that to the black man. He summoned the one who criticized him for the color of his mother's skin. Demanded he come and present himself. Then he asked him. He said, did you actually do that? Did you actually say that? And when the person said yes, the Prophet said, Innaka umrun fika jahiliyyah. He said, you are a man with ignorance in you. Changing the mentality, letting everybody know this is not acceptable. Zero tolerance. Also establishing a zero tolerance policy. We will not accept this. This behavior will not be accepted. And he's saying about a companion who will remain nameless, who he loved and respected, and he spoke about highly in another hadith. So even though the person was someone who was respected by the Prophet ﷺ, loved by the Prophet, when that person did wrong, and that wrong had to do with what? Racism and racial inequality, the Prophet dealt with it, established a zero tolerance policy, and educated the people that this is what? I'm sorry, not educated them, but attempted to change the mindset of the people regarding this type of thing. This behavior is unacceptable. But the Prophet didn't stop there. He didn't just speak about racism and racial inequality and ending it, or simply teach that racism was wrong. He took practical steps to eradicate. The Prophet ﷺ did what? He did policy as well. He didn't stop with education. He knew that the two need each other. You have to change policy. You have to change what? The mindset. You have to educate the people. So he did that. So during the conquest of Mecca, how did the Prophet educate? The Prophet ﷺ, during the conquest of Mecca, on that first day, the time for prayer came in. So he summoned Bilal. The Prophet could have asked anybody to give the adhan. He summoned Bilal. Then he didn't just tell Bilal, okay, just give the adhan. No, he told Bilal to climb up on the what? On the top of the Kaaba. On the top of the Kaaba, the holiest, sacred, most honored and revered structure of the Arabs at that time. And all of them were assembled. They were all out there. And he told Bilal, climb on top of the Kaaba and give the adhan. So there he was, and all these people who had not yet accepted Islam, all of them were there looking up at Bilal. Looking up at this black slave with his feet on their holiest structure, calling the call to prayer. They had to look up at him as if the Prophet is trying to etch in their mind this mashhad, this image of a black man on top of the Kaaba calling the adhan as if to say he is honored in the sight of Allah, he is special, he has value, he has worth because he's a believer. And you're worthless and down here beneath him because you're a non-believer. Look how the Prophet ﷺ is taking these practical steps to eradicate racism. Etching in the minds of the people an imagery that says that this is right and what you have always believed and practiced is wrong. The Prophet didn't stop there. The Prophet ﷺ, he married Zainab bin Jahsh to Zayd ibn Haritha, a black freed slave. That was something unheard of during the Prophet's time. Especially Zaynab bin Jahsh. They have this thing in Saudi Arabia where they say they have 110 families, they have 220 families, right? 220 means what? It's like a very, like the nobility, the highest level of status in the society. This is Zainab bin Jahsh, radiallahu anha. The Prophet marries her to Zayd ibn Haritha, a freed black slave. Unheard of, but he did it. Didn't stop there. He married Hala bint Auf, the sister of Abdurrahman ibn Auf, again, min al-Shurafa. He marries her to what? To Bilal. And when Fatima bint Qais received marriage proposals from two Qurashis. Qurashis are what? The top, the cream of the crop of the Arabs at that time. She received two proposals from two Qurashis. The Prophet said, Inki Usama ibn Zayd. He said, marry Usama ibn Zayd instead. Another black, free son of a freed slave. Insisted on it. And after they were married, she said, other women were jealous of us and jealous of what we had, the relationship we had. Al-Muhim, Islam didn't stop there. It also banned segregation on the basis of race, lineage, socioeconomic status, etc. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give two examples from the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Kahf, He says, وَاصْبِرْ نَفْسَكَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَهُ يريدون وجهه ولا تعد عيناك عنهم تريد زينة الحياة الدنيا ولا تطع من أغفلنا قلبه عن ذكرنا واتبع هواه وكان أمره فرطا. He says, and patiently remain in the company of those who call upon their Lord in the morning and the evening, seeking His face. And let not your eyes pass beyond them, desiring adornments of the worldly life. And do not obey one whose heart we have made heedless of our remembrance, and will follow his desires and his affairs in disarray. The context of the revelation of this ayah was that the Qurashis, again, like we said, they were the cream of the Arab crop. They said, Muhammad will come, we'll listen to you. We'll listen to what you have to say. But you got these people here, they're lowlifes, man. They're not on our level in terms of status and rank in the society. And so we can't be seen sitting with them. So you've got to remove them from the gathering and have a private gathering for us, for the special people. If you do that, then we'll sit with you and hear what you have to say. We'll give you audience. And perhaps the Prophet considered it because he wanted to guide the people to the haqq. He wanted to guide the people to the truth. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, don't do that. Don't segregate. We all Muslims. We all looking for truth. We all can sit together. No segregation. Another verse which was revealed in the same context is from Surah Al-An'am, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said something similar. He said, وَلَا تَطْرُدِ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَهُ مَا عَلَيْكَ مِنْ حِسَابِهِمْ مِنْ شَيْءٍ وَمَا مِنْ حِسَابِكَ عَلَيْهِمْ مِنْ شَيْءٍ فَتَطْرُدَهُمْ فَتَكُونَ مِنَ الظَّالِمِينَ. Allah says, and do not chase away those who call upon their Lord morning and afternoon, seeking His face. You are not responsible for their account, and they are not responsible for yours. So were you to send them away, you would in that case be from the wrongdoers. Segregation in our religion is what? Is wrong. We don't separate people based upon race and ethnicity and color and tribe. We're all Muslims, we're all believers, and we all what? We're all together. And that's why if you look at the Hajj, it's a bunch of people wearing the most modest clothing and doing the same act of worship, and there's no what? There's no disparity, such that you don't know a king from a pauper during Hajj. Islam didn't stop there. It also established itself as a meritocracy, where men and women were equal in the eyes of their Lord, and status, value, and importance were based upon the content of one's character, not external features or material possessions. Consider the statement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in which He illustrates this. And I want to add to this that another type of racism, and remember we said racism is broad in our religion. Another type of racism that was practiced in the time of the Prophet ﷺ was racism based upon social handicaps. And also actual physical handicaps, like blindness, right? Like a person's, like their stature. If they had, like, for example, some type of disease, like a skin disease. Or if they had a social handicap like being an orphan or being a widow or something like that. That people would treat them like lepers. They would look down upon them, step over them. They would usurp their rights, etc. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, again, all of this is kind of wrapped together from the Islamic perspective. Racism is broad, as we mentioned earlier. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses this whole concept of meritocracy in Islam as it relates to what? Racism in the broad Islamic sense. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, عَبَسَ وَتَوَلَّى أَنْ جَاءَهُ الْأَعْمَى وَمَا يُدْرِيكَ لَعَلَّهُ يَزَّكَّى أو يذكر فتنفعه الذكرى أما من استغنى وأما من استغنى. Oh man, come on Abd'Llah, you can't forget this. أما من استغنى أما من استغنى فما عليك ألا يزكى وأما من جاءك يسعى وأما من جاءك يسعى وهو يخشى فأنت عنه تلهى. And I think again sometimes this memory fails me, but anyway, the meaning in English, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, he, the prophet, frowned and turned away because the blind man came interrupting. But what would make you perceive, O Muhammad, that perhaps he might be purified or be reminded, and the reminder would benefit him because of his sincerity? As for him who considers himself without need of Allah or his guidance, to him you give your full attention, but there is no blame upon you if he refuses and is therefore not purified. As for him who came to you striving for knowledge of truth and fears Allah, from him you were distracted. No, kalla, no, it should not be like that. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala establishes this whole concept of meritocracy. That the one who comes sincerely seeking truth, he what? He should be given precedence. That's what matters, the sincerity and the true desire for truth, not the person's status in Islam or lack thereof. Also consider the hadith or the athar from Ibn Abbas, who said, من أحب في الله وأبغض في الله ووالى في الله وعاد في الله فإنما تنال ولاية الله بذلك ولن يجد عبد طعم الإيمان وإن كثر صلاته وصومه حتى يكون كذلك وقد صارت عامة مؤاخاة الناس على أمر الدنيا وذلك لا يجدي على أهله شيئا. He said, he who loves for Allah's sake and hates for Allah's sake, associates for Allah's sake and disassociates for Allah's sake, it is only thereby that one can attain Allah's friendship. No person can ever hope to taste the sweetness of faith, no matter how frequently he prays or how regularly he fasts, until he is like this. Nowadays, this is the important part. Nowadays, people's alliances and friendships are based upon worldly things, not a meritocracy. How you look, what's your ethnicity, what language do you speak, what part of the world did you come from. These are the things that make a person, elevate a person, and put another person down. But that will not benefit them anything when they meet Allah on the Day of Judgment. So in summary, brothers and sisters, Islam's solution to racism and racial inequality included the following. We're just going to mention, repeat these matters because we need to recreate that in our communities. Number one, zero tolerance policy. Number two, policy changes. We change the way we do things to remove racial prejudice, racial inequality, not to promote it. Number three, education and a concerted effort to change the existing racist mentality. And this is what we're doing right now as a part of that. People will see the title and tune out. Oh, come on, enough of this, man. After George, that's all these jokers want to talk about. No, we need to talk about this. We need to educate ourselves. We need to change our mentality. This is an important part of what's going to make us better. Number four, establishing itself as a meritocracy. And number five, it banned segregation. Last but not least, brothers and sisters, I have a few closing remarks that I wanted to make. Because what do we do with this information? This is really what's important. We can talk till we're blue in the face. It's like, what are we going to do? It's the action that matters, right? So one thing is, a question that we need to ask ourselves is, why does racism exist in Islamic communities today? Right? I actually heard a brother say, he said it to my face actually, I didn't hear him say, he said it to me. He said, Islam has failed at eradicating racism. And this statement, brothers and sisters, is wrong. Islam hasn't failed. We Muslims have failed. fail to implement Islam and practice it properly. We, brothers and sisters, we have a problem as Muslims where we consistently give precedence to cultural and societal norms over Islamic precepts. This is our problem. That the culture gets in the way of practicing Islam. We know what Islam says. We be the first ones. You'll see people nowadays. Now that all this stuff is popping off, Muslims get the mic and they're saying there's no Islamic racism, and they're quoting the ayah from Surah Al-Hujurat. Ya ayyuhan nasu inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha wa ja'alnakum. They're quoting the ayah and then quoting the ayah, leaving the stage, leaving the podium, and practicing racism in their mosques. Because why? Oh, that's just the way it is. That's the way we are. That's making excuses for it. So the problem is not that Islam has failed. The Muslims have failed. They failed to practice what Islam teaches. The second thing I wanted to mention is that we have the solution, and it's time for Muslims to lead. We have something that the whole world needs, and the country that we live in needs. It needs a solution to the race problem. This is a problem. It's worldwide. It's in the Muslim community. Unfortunately, it shouldn't be. And it's outside the Muslim community. Who got the solution? These people don't got the solution. They don't have a clue. We got the solution. We need to be leading this charge. We need to be leading the charge. We need to be leading the charge on this and other issues as well. Other social issues and resolving those issues. But the problem, which brings us to the third point, is before we can lead, we have to clean up our own house. How's it going to look if my house is dirty? Filthy. I go to my neighbor's house, knock on their door. Bop, bop, bop. Hey, you need to pick this up. You need to get that. This looks disgusting. This is nasty. This is awful. I'm telling them to clean up their house, and my house is dirty. How's that going to look? How's that going to look? We have to clean up our own house. We have issues with racism in our communities, and we don't want to deal with it. We want to look past it. We want to quote some ayat and a hadith and say there's no racism in the Muslim community. No, there's no racism in Islam, but there's racism in the Muslim community. We need to deal with it. Because before we can go out and lead and tell other people, we have to practice ourselves. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, lima taquluna ma la taf'alun. Kabura maqtan inda Allah an taqulu ma la taf'alun. Oh, you believe. Why do you say that what you do not do? Most hated and despicable it is in the sight of Allah that you say that what you do not do. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the other ayah from Surah Al-Baqarah, أَتَأْمُرُونَ النَّاسَ بِالْبِرِّ وَتَنْسَوْنَ أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَنْتُمْ تَتْلُونَ الْكِتَابَ أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. He said, do you command people to practice righteousness and forget to practice it yourselves while you are readers of the scripture? And therefore you should know better. Have you no sense? Brothers and sisters, if we go out and we talk about racism, we speak against racism, we say we got the cure, we got the solution, you need to listen to us, you need to get to the back and let us lead. We can show you how to eradicate racism from your societies. If we say that, people will ask us, don't you treat blacks and Africans poorly in your mosques? Don't you call them abid, slaves, qirad, apes, behind their backs? Because of the color of their skin. You call them abid and you call them qirad, you call them slaves and apes for no other reason than the color of their skin. And there's people been busted doing this, man. There's like Facebook posts and Instagram posts where people have got that and just outed these people from our communities, Muslim communities who are Arab, who are Desi, who are Indian, and they're saying these awful, terrible things about African American and African Muslims. And there's other people from their communities who are going on social media and outing them and saying, yeah, in our community we call blacks this and we do this and we say this. So people are going to ask you, don't you guys do this? Don't you guys do this? Don't you seek to marry your daughters and sons to the fairest members of your communities and shun people with dark skin? Not just Africans and African Americans, even from their own communities. The Indian community, they shun the dark Indians. Arabs shun the dark Arabs. Desis shun the dark Desis. Come on, man. We got a problem with racism and colorism and tribalism, and we got to clean that up. We got to clean that up before, and maybe. This is where our focus needs to be right now. Clean up our own house. Having these type of discussions and dialogues and this type of discourse around race. Stop running from it. Stop saying, okay, enough, we got it. Okay, we're going to put up a post on our website that we support Black Lives Matter, and we're done with it, right? No, we're not done with it. We need to clean up our own house and put ourselves in a position to lead, and we can't lead until what? Until our house is clean. With that, brothers and sisters, we'll bring our talk to a close. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless your houses, to bless your spouses, to bless you, to bless the rest of your evening, and to make you blessed wherever you may be. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those who listen to the talk and follow the best of it. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from those who He teaches beneficial knowledge, and who He truly benefits from the knowledge that He teaches us, by making us from those who put it into practice. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.